Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here. I am so excited to finally make this video. We're not going to talk about how far into January it is by now. It is a very gloomy day, but we're leaning into the atmosphere. I feel like it's adding to the tension because today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 books of 2024 from number 10 up to number 1. I had a strange reading year this year. I read far more books than I have ever read before. I read 56 books in 2024 and the most I'd ever read in a year before that was 34, so a significant jump there, and that is definitely thanks to the fact that I started my YouTube channel up a little over a year ago now. It was early January of last year that I started making videos, and because of this channel I have read so much more, so I'm so grateful for that. But I had a bit of a rough one in terms of the quality of the books that I was reading, or more how they worked for me personally. I read a lot of books that just didn't quite do that much for me and my personal taste. I didn't have that many books that I hated, but I had a lot of kind of middle of the road books. But thankfully, I did manage to put together a list of 10 books that I really did love and enjoy. So without further ado, let's get into the list. So number 10 on this list we have Morgan Is My Name by Sophie Keach. This is an Arthurian legend retelling. This is the first in a trilogy retelling the life of Morgan Le Fay. The second book is already out. I think the third one may be on the way this year. I am really interested in Arthurian legends. I don't know that much about them. I'm by no means an expert, but I love that area of history. I grew up watching Merlin. Also, Wales is just my favourite place, and obviously a lot of Arthuriana is set in Wales, so this seemed like it would be perfectly my kind of thing, and it definitely was. I listened to the audiobook of this one, which I would highly recommend. It was beautifully narrated. All of the accents in here are incredible. There's one French character, and when I tell you, I have not really had many characters that I've been like swooning for this year, but there is a character in here. And I don't know if it was just the accent, but something about them, it really got me. I think there's something about flirting in medieval language that really just works for me. But this is also not a romance. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. There is an element of romance in here, but it's much more of a coming of age story. It's a story about Morgan going through a lot of trials. It is a very rocky time in the UK. Before it even was the UK, I guess. There are a lot of different settlements that are battling and trying to seize power of greater parts of the land, and Morgan's family ends up getting wrapped up in that. And so much happens in here that it is kind of wild that this is just the first of 3 books telling the story of her life, so I'm really excited to get to the next one in the series. I think this is one where the series as a whole could become an all-time favourite. I don't think that this book on its own could, because it very much is following just from one beat of her life to the next, so it didn't feel necessarily like it was wrapped up. I think I will need to finish the series to understand my full thoughts on this one. But I had a great time reading it, and I think that this is a really promising series for me. So that is Morgan Is My Name by Sophie Keach. Number 9 on this list, ironically enough, is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I finally did it, guys. I know some of you doubted me. That's okay. I doubted myself. I was ranting about reading this all year in 2024, and I finally read it and I finished it on New Year's Eve. For anyone who doesn't know, all I really knew about this book going into it was that it is about lesbian necromancers in space. It is fantasy sci-fi, there's a lot of creepy bone magic going on and a bit of a mystery. We have our main character Gideon and her mortal enemy Harrow, and the two of them somehow end up in kind of a haunted house together. That was all I really knew, and I think probably that's the best way to do it, because this is such a wild ride that you kind of just want to go along for it with no prior understanding or anything to sway you, which was my issue with this book. And I say that having it at number 9 on my favourites list. I had such a good time reading this, but I think I could have had a better one if I had tempered my own expectations, because everyone had told me for years that this book was going to absolutely change my life. So I ended up reading it in my last video, my This Video Doesn't End Until I Find a 5-Star Read video, which it was a disaster. And I thought this was kind of the safest bet, but because of that, I put too much pressure on it. So I think I could have enjoyed this more. So the fact that it is still on here on my favorites list tells you how good of a book it is. If you like a good mystery and some really irreverent humor that will just really catch you off guard at the darkest moments, Gideon will just say something so blunt or stupid that you can't help but laugh, then I would definitely recommend this one. It is pretty dark at times, be warned. There were definitely places it took me to that I did not expect. And again, highly recommend the audiobook for this one. This is read by Maura Quirk, who is fast becoming my favourite audiobook narrator, and she does an incredible job because there are a lot of characters in here and she really takes them and makes them so different in the way that she voices them. There are so many accents and inflections in here, and she adds to the humour as well. Anything that was already funny in here, she really makes even funnier. I will say I don't think it is as confusing as it is sometimes made out to be. It is confusing, but in kind of a mystery way. It's meant to be. It's not confusing in a you're tearing your hair out, having no clue what's going on, or not enjoying it kind of way. I wouldn't be intimidated by this one if you are a big fantasy reader or sci-fi reader. I think that you will be able to grasp kind of the gist of what's going on, at least. I've also now started Harrow and I am liking that one, I think, even more than I like this one. So glad I finally got to Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. At number 8 on this list, we have a book by an author I had never read before this year, and now I really enjoy the work of, and this is Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. I read this right at the start of the year off of a recommendation from Carrie Can Read. She really enjoys this series, so I thought I would give it a go, and I'm so glad that I did. This is a fantasy story following Stephen, who is a paladin, except his god died several years ago now. So he is now living his life with the power left over from his paladin years, but with nowhere to put that power. He's very directionless and he feels guilty for the liability that he can be when his power kind of explodes out of him. But his life is suddenly turned around when he meets a fugitive perfumer called Grace, and they then end up witnessing an attempted assassination together. And from there they have to try to untangle things and figure out what's going on while a killer is also stalking the streets. This, I would say, at its core is a romance and a character study rather than a mystery. There is a mystery in here, but I wouldn't say that that is the main plot of this one. T. Kingfisher is just so funny. I, again, listened to the audiobook for this one. I have been a big audiobook fan this year, and it made me laugh out loud many, many times. I think that both Grace and Stephen are so endearing. Grace is a very soft, caring and a little bit insecure character, which I really appreciated seeing. I love a strong female character, but we're allowed to have these soft and gentle ones as well. And then Stephen was also quite a gentle soul. I thought his character was just so interesting because he was this big burly man who was very strong and had all of this power, but at his core he was so gentle and loving and full of guilt and these feelings that he didn't deserve anything good. They're just both such endearing characters, and all of the side characters in here were really funny as well. I know that there are more books in this series that follow some of them, so I'm really excited to get to those. But this was just such a fun, cozy time, even though there were some kind of creepy, gross things going on as per T. Kingfisher lore. Mostly it was just really heartwarming. And like I said, I read this right at the start of the year for a 24-hour reading vlog. I think it was my first ever one, and it was properly winter, and this was just the perfect read for that season. I think this is a brilliant cozy read for the winter time. So glad I got to Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. At number 7 on this list we have The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. This is my boyfriend's favourite book of all time, and he had been begging me to read this one ever since he finished it, and I can see why. I'm gonna do an awful job at explaining this one because the world in here is one of the most unique fantasy settings I've ever read from, which is so funny because this is primarily a romance, I would say. There is adventure and world building to this one, but the main threads in here really are these two main characters who have the hots for each other but also hate each other's guts. But I will try to summarize. This is set in a fantasy world that is a bit similar to our own in terms of technology level, but there are some weird quirky differences, like people drive around in auto ducks on waterways instead of in cars on roads. There are also drudges in this land, which are basically zombies, and they live beyond a veil, but they have been known to escape into the mortal realm where people live, and obviously that is very dangerous. So one of our main characters, Hart, is a marshal. It's very cowboy energy, but his job is basically to keep the grudges in check and protect anyone who has reason to go beyond the veil. But it does mean that he has cause to often visit an undertaker, because anytime a grudge is taken out, that body will then have to be taken back through the veil to the human realm and catalogued and given the proper rites. And Mercy runs such an establishment, and they really do not get on. They had a disagreement the first time they met and ever since have just really ruffled each other's feathers up anytime they meet. But Mercy is really struggling with her family not understanding her or listening to her, and Hart is just very lonely. So one day he writes a letter just out to the world, to no one in particular, and it ends up somehow at Mercy's door. The two of them end up writing back and forth but having no idea who they might be getting to know on the other end. And this is just such a fun time. I love that you've got male trope. The tension between these two because of their animosity really just adds to the fun of this developing romance. There are so many endearing side characters in this. The world is so quirky and weird, sometimes seemingly for no reason, but in such a fun way. And the weirdness is never overwhelming. This, to me, has some of the best world building I've ever read because it's really subtle. I will say there is kind of a choice made towards the end of the plot that personally didn't quite work for me, and I think that's the reason that this wasn't like a 5-star all-time favorite book. I think otherwise it probably would have been, but I still just had such a fun time with this one, and I think the romantasy girlies who haven't gotten to this one yet, you're missing out. That is The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. Number 6 on this list is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. What kind of top 10 list would this be for me if there wasn't an Emily Henry book on here? I had really been saving this one, and after I read Funny Story by Emily Henry earlier in the year and I didn't love it as much as I was hoping, I really just wanted to get back into her backlist, and I'd heard such good things about this one. So Chris, my boyfriend, and I ended up buddy reading this one, which was so fun. He is a romance girly at his core, and this one, it did the job. It did what Emily Henry comes to do, which is make me sob. I think I have a picture of what I looked like finishing this book, so enjoy that. But I was sick as well, just to clarify. This is the story of Nora, who is a literary agent. She's very much a big business, big city woman, and she has a history of men leaving her for small town women when they go away on a trip, almost like they would in a romance novel. It feels like a cliche at this point. So when her sister decides that they should go on an extended trip away to the countryside together, she is understandably reluctant, but she will do just about anything for her sister. So she ends up in this tiny little village where, by strange happenstance, she bumps into Charlie Lastra. Charlie is a book editor who she has met several times before, and none of those times has ever been pretty. For some reason, they have just never got on. But as they are thrown together again and again during this trip, they learn more about themselves and each other and begin to unravel the stories that they have written for themselves. Emily Henry just knows how to write in a way that is going to punch me in the gut. The way that her characters speak is the perfect amount of realistic combined with romance speech for me. It's not too outlandish, but just kind of elevated She writes flirting like no other. But I think really what gets me most of the time is the way that she writes other relationships in her books. It's not just about the two main characters who are inevitably going to fall in love. There are so many other great relationships within her books, and the side characters feel like real people with depth to them. I loved reading about Nora's relationship with her sister and the flaws in it that appeared throughout this book. I found so interesting, and they really just got me. And the way that she talks about stories in this one, as an aspiring writer myself, and the same for Chris, my partner, he's also a writer. Both of us came away from this book with that sort of affirmation of our feelings about stories and just that raw love for storytelling. This is definitely up there in my Emily Henry ranking. I don't think anything will ever manage to take the spot that Happy Place holds in my heart, but I think that this one has to come in second. So that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. At number 5 on this list, we have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. I did not expect to love this one as much as I did. I didn't even expect to read it. It had always floated around and I'd heard really great things about it, but it seemed too spooky for me. I don't tend to read gothic novels. I am a big coward in terms of what I read, so I'd kind of just put it in that box in my head of, it's probably a great book, but not for me. But this came in at the library that I work at, and I just kept seeing it on the shelf while I was shelving books and tidying, and I just kept being drawn to it. So I decided to pick it up, and I am so glad that I did, because this was so stunningly written. I personally am a huge fan of flowery prose. I think this is the kind of story that probably won't work for everyone. The writing is very much of a particular style, but it was my particular style. This is the story of a man who I think remains unnamed throughout this book, but he falls in love with a woman and he marries her because they both have a shared interest in fairy tales. Both of them crave that feeling of whimsy and magic and that space in between. And she is very, very rich, so she has the opportunity to provide that kind of luxury fairy tale feeling. She keeps whisking him away to castles, feeding him the most exquisite foods, and decorating their house in the most ethereal but kind of dark way. The only thing that she asks of him, and she makes him promise, is to never ask about her past. But then her aunt ends up growing sick, and they both of them have to travel back to her hometown and the house that she was raised in. And the more that he learns from this place, this house that almost seems to speak to him, the more he wonders if he can keep that promise. This was just delicious. Every time I talk about this book, I feel like I'm using words that relate to food because it almost felt like I was feasting. The language that Roshani Chokshi uses in here is just so decadent and exaggerated, and it's meant to be because these characters are like that. That is what they crave from the world, and that is the way that they view life. There are many, many dark things that happen in here. We delve into this wife's history, a friendship that she had growing up. This is told in kind of 2 different timelines, and they're kind of slowly coming together. In the present, you're finding things out about that history, and in the history, you're slowly coming towards something. You have this feeling throughout of being pulled along to a point of no return. There's so much tension, but it's also so luxurious, and it's really just like nothing I've ever read before. It really opened my eyes to the fact that maybe I do like gothic novels, or at least ones that are written as beautifully as this. So that is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. At number 4 on this list, we have The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Anna Marie Crowhurst. And this is another one that I really didn't expect to love the way that I did. This was recommended to me by my boyfriend's sister. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have read it because this is a historical novel. There's no fantasy in here, and I don't read historical novels normally, or at least I didn't until I read this one. This is the story, as you might have guessed, of Ursula Flight. It's set in the 1600s, and we follow her from a very young age. I think we start with her as a toddler through her adolescence into womanhood, and she is fascinated by all things theatre. She would absolutely love to be a playwright, but of course, that wasn't really a possibility for a woman at this time. In terms of theatre, a woman was only really allowed to be on the stage itself, and even then, that's not a respectable position. So instead, at quite a young age, Ursula is married off, as a woman would have been back then. I just love stories that follow someone throughout their life from event to event without kind of putting pressure on that structure. I like that it feels more realistic when the purpose of something happening in a book is more just for character development than to urge on any kind of plot. This is very much a character heavy book, so if you're looking for a huge plot, this is not the one for that. But Ursula is such a strong character. She's so full of fun and determination. She's so resilient, even when she goes through some pretty awful things. This really delves into the way that women were treated at this time, and this is a woman of pretty good standing, never mind what women of the lower classes would have been treated like. And then the writing in here, it's so fun. This is kind of a mixed media narrative because Ursula is so focused on plays and scripts. There are several portions of this book that are written in script format, and it kind of comes out of nowhere. We'll have an important dinner coming up, and then the scene will be set as if the scene in a script is being set. And then we will have all of the different characters' dialogues labelled with little asides from Ursula, and it is just so creative, and then it spirals from there into other formats as well. So we've got diaries, lists, tables, pros and con tables. It felt like every chapter there was something new, and I was just so engaged. And again, as a writer myself, it really just felt like something was unlocking in my mind as I read this, because the amount of creativity in the way that this is written, the rules that it breaks, I just had so much fun reading it and so much fun thinking about how my writing could grow from reading a book like this. This really opened my eyes to both a new genre for me. I never really would have thought I'd love historical fiction the way that I loved this, but now I really want to read more of it, and also just the creativity in here, the storytelling, the characters, and the imagination in the formatting was just so inspiring to me. So that is The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Anna Marie Crowhurst. I'm so sorry, I just realised I had lipstick on my teeth. I'm just too enthusiastic. It's going everywhere. Now here we are at the top 3 books that I read last year. At number 3 we have The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love by India Halton. This is a historical fantasy set in a version of our world, I think around the early 1900s, late 1800s, but please don't quote me on that. But this is a world that is basically like ours, but there are magical birds. And our main character, Beth, is an ornithologist, a scholar of these strange magical birds. And at the beginning of this story, a contest is announced. There is one particularly rare bird that has been spotted in England, and the first ornithologist to find it will be named Birder of the Year and also given tenure at their university. And of course, Beth desperately wants this honour, but she has been collaborating with another ornithologist who is much more experienced than her. And then comes along Professor Devon Lockley, who is a rakish rival ornithologist. And the two of them keep getting thrown together in very strange ways, almost as if something in the world is conspiring to keep them together. So they end up on a mad caper from France back to England and through the English countryside, hunting for this bird, working through their animosity, slowly getting to know each other, and oh, this is so fun. India Halton is clearly a huge fan of romance because she just knows all of the tropes back to front, and she manages to twist them all on their heads in such a fun way. I don't want to spoil any of them for you, but she'll have things like the one bed trope in here, but it won't be one bed anymore. It will be something strange and funny that she's thrown at you, and none of it is very serious. You cannot take this book very seriously. It is meant to be so funny and whimsical and silly, except for the fact that the characters really do have heart and soul to them and depth. Beth is incredibly polite and conflict-averse at the beginning, and as the story continues we watch her grow and be able to stand up for herself. And Devon, of course, first appears as just an absolute rake, but we learn that he has a lot more depth to him than first meets the eye. India Halton just has so much fun with this one. She really just took every single situation and ended it in a way that I could not have expected, and it always made me laugh. There is another book in this series coming out next year. I think it is The Geographer's Map to Romance. Is that right? Yes, I was correct. And I'm so excited for that one. Again, highly recommend the audiobook for this one as well. I thought it was told so well and really took on board the whimsy and humour in here. But there's definitely a theme of fun and whimsy in a lot of my favourite reads, and that was just so exemplary here. So that is The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love by India Halton. At number 2 on my list is another historical fantasy which I have just learned this year is one of my favourite things, and this is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. I cannot fathom why this book doesn't have more buzz about it. I think it deserves so much love. This is set in a fantasy world that is not our own, but it is clearly inspired by kind of an Edwardian England. But in this setting, magic exists through the summoning of spirits, and women do have innate magic to them, but they are not allowed to train in furthering this magic, and they are not allowed to use magic when they get married, because if they were to try to summon a spirit while they had a baby growing inside of them, that would be very dangerous because that spirit could latch onto that unborn child. And because of this, women's magic has to be suppressed, and when they get married they have to put on a collar that means they can't perform magic at all. Now our main character is being put forward for bargaining season. Her family really want to find her preferably a pretty wealthy husband because they have made some poor financial decisions and are in quite a bit of debt. But all Beatrice, our protagonist, wants to do is to become a sorcerer. She loves her magic and she wants to get stronger at it. So as soon as she arrives at the city where she is to enter her first bargaining season, she secretly sets out to find a magical grimoire that will help her become the powerful sorceress that she dreams of being. But just as she is about to buy this tome, another sorceress manages to snatch it from her and whisk it away. Now Beatrice's only chance to get it back, and with it her hopes of becoming a sorceress, is to summon a spirit herself and make a bargain with them. This, again, really took me by surprise. I know that I love this genre. I love the Austen vibes. I grew up watching all of the Austen adaptations and period dramas, and I just love that area. I love all of the silly rules of that time, the romance that all brings about. There is something about that kind of setting that just really gets me, and then you throw magic in there and it's just everything I could ever want. There is a romance plotline in here and I think it is done so well. Again, this one was narrated by Maura Quirk, the audiobook narrator that I mentioned earlier, and this is where I fell in love with her because she does so many accents throughout this book. She really adds to the confidence and the kind of gumption of our main character is the only word I can think of. But she also voices the romantic interest so well. And the spirits themselves. Anytime a spirit comes up, of course, they're a very otherworldly creature, and she captures that so well in making them kind of overly characterful, almost like they're just too full of life. This had all of that quirk and wonder and whimsy of the time period, as well as an incredible romance, incredible female relationships in here, both between our main character and an unlikely friend that she makes, as well as her and her sister and her mother, and it just explores so many feminist themes. The way that the magic is set up in here just allows for so much to be explored. There were moments where this made me so angry that I cried. It was so frustrating, but it was also one of the most satisfying endings to a book that I have read in such a long time. I just think this book deserves so much love, and if you like those kind of fantasy of manners, historical fantasy stories, then I just cannot recommend this one enough. It needs to be at the top of that list. So that is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. And we have made it to number 1, my favourite book of the year, which I think is going to be a surprise to no one who has been watching my channel. I hope you will bear with me as I rant about my favourite thing that I have read this year one more time. Probably not one more time, let's be real. I will be ranting about this forever. This is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. You know what's so funny? It's so funny to me that my favourite book of the year was written by a man because no other books on this list were written by men, and the reason that I read this was because I was filming a video where I drew prompts out of my little prompt jar. This one here, it's got a lot of silly little prompts in there, and the morning that I started that video, my boyfriend made me add a new prompt that was read a book written by a man because both of us realised we'd barely read any books written by men so far this year, and I picked it out and I ended up reading this one. I have so much love for this book, again because it opened my eyes to a whole new kind of subgenre for me, which I guess is a theme you can see here. A lot of the time my favourite reads are books that take me wildly by surprise. This is a fantasy mystery set in a world where giant horrific leviathans come out of the sea every few seasons. So the structure of this world is that you are much, much safer if you live in the centre of this landmass than you are if you live right at the edges, and there are lots of different rings of walls that keep you safer, again, if you live closer to the middle. So of course all of the rich people live in that capital in the centre, and all of the poorer people live out towards the edge. It's a really interesting class structure. But then on top of that, the magic system comes from these leviathans because when they are felled, their body parts can then be stripped down, and because these titans are inherently magical in some way, these parts can then be used to kind of infuse that magic into people. They can have augmentations that give them some kind of power. So our main character, Din, has one of these augmentations which gives him a perfect memory, basically. So the story begins with him going to a crime scene to engrave all of the information. That's how they describe it. He is engraving it into his mind. But this is a very strange crime scene because someone has been killed by a giant tree erupting out of their body. He then takes this information back to Anna, the investigator that he works for, and she is such a brilliant character. She's so smart, but also so incredibly blunt and bad with people. And she also is incredibly overwhelmed by the world. She can't really leave her house without wearing a blindfold and several different things to kind of muffle her senses. So that's why she needs Din, along with his perfect memory, to kind of feed that information back to her so that she can make those incredible links with her brilliant mind. But even for her, this is a bit of a strange one, and what at first seems like it is just a local murder begins to spiral into something further and something much more treacherous. These two characters end up developing a proper Sherlock and Watson kind of relationship as they unravel how deep this goes, how much corruption is involved. I just devoured this book. It is so compulsively fun and interesting and exciting to read. The magic in here is so interesting, and the creepy kind of sicknesses from plants and fungi, the infection, it just makes for such a strong and atmospheric world. I really love mushrooms and I find them really interesting, so that I think added to my interest in this setting. But I also found all of the characters in here to be so interesting, especially our main two. They were so flawed but endearing, and I loved their kind of begrudging relationship that developed between them. But I don't think there were any characters in here that didn't feel interesting to me and like they were complex people. I just don't think that I have experienced the feeling that this book gave me in a long time. I really just felt such a love for reading while I raced through this. And I don't think as I was reading it I thought it was going to be a 5-star, because usually for me a 5-star is something that I can personally relate to, something that I see myself in. And this didn't necessarily have that. I mean, there was nothing necessarily in here that I personally related to, but I just had such a fun time reading it, and when I came out of it all I wanted to do was read it again or read the sequel, which is coming out in a couple of months and I cannot wait for. And I had the biggest book hangover. Nothing was hitting like The Tainted Cup. This really just reminded me how much I love to read, so I cannot thank it enough for that. So that is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. A man! So those are my 10 favourite books of 2024. I would absolutely love to know what your favourite book of 2024 was, or if you want to give me a list, feel free. Is there a particular theme to your favourite books of the year as well? I think for me, it is that feeling of finding a book that is out of my comfort zone and maybe I didn't expect to love as much as I did, but has kind of opened my eyes to a whole new genre or subgenre or theme that I find interesting. I would love to know if you can see a link in what made your favourite books of 2024 your favourite books. I think that's really interesting. If you want to see me reading any of these, then I will link down below any vlogs in which I read some of these so you can kind of see my live reaction if that sounds interesting to you. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here. If you were here for any of my 2024 videos, thank you so much. And I cannot wait to make more and read more in 2025. I hope you are having the loveliest day and the loveliest start to your year, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye-bye.